My dad skipped my college graduation to watch my brother's Little League game, so I uninvited him from meeting his first grandchild. The phone call came 3 days before my graduation ceremony. I was sitting in my apartment finishing the last revisions on my senior thesis when Dad's name lit up my screen. I answered expecting to hear about travel plans or where we'd meet before the ceremony. Instead, his voice had that careful tone he used when he was about to disappoint me. He said there was a scheduling conflict. My younger brother, Devin, had a Little League playoff game the same afternoon as my graduation, and Dad felt he needed to be there to support him. I sat there holding the phone, watching my reflection in the dark computer screen, trying to process what he'd just said. I asked if he was serious, if he was really choosing a Little League game over my college graduation. He got defensive immediately, saying I was being selfish, that Devin was only 9 years old and needed his support, that I was 22 and should understand how important this was for my brother. He reminded me that graduation was just a ceremony, that I'd already earned my degree, that the moment had already happened whether he was there or not. I told him graduation wasn't just a ceremony. It was the culmination of 4 years of work, of student loans I'd be paying off for the next decade, of late nights and stress and sacrifice. He said he understood, but Devin's game was a big deal for him, that he'd been practicing all season, that Dad had promised to be there. I asked when he'd promised Devin this, and there was a pause before he admitted it was last week, 3 weeks after I'd sent him my graduation invitation. He'd known about my ceremony for months. He'd RSVP'd yes. He told me he was proud of me and couldn't wait to see me walk across that stage, but apparently, a 9-year-old's baseball game was more important than his oldest son's college graduation. Mom got on the phone next, her voice apologetic, but not contradictory. She said they'd decided as a family that Devin's game took priority because he was younger and wouldn't understand if they missed it. She promised they'd take me out to a nice dinner the following weekend to celebrate. I asked if she was coming to graduation without Dad, and she said she felt she should support Dad's decision and be there for Devin as a united front. I hung up without saying goodbye. My girlfriend Priya found me sitting on the couch an hour later, staring at nothing. She asked what was wrong, and I told her my parents weren't coming to graduation. She looked confused, said my mom had posted on Facebook just yesterday about how excited she was for my big day. I showed her the text messages I'd sent after the call, asking them to reconsider, explaining how much this meant to me. Neither of them had responded. Priya sat down next to me and said this was insane, that they were choosing a random baseball game over a once-in-a-lifetime event. I tried to explain the pattern I'd been seeing for years, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Dad missed my high school awards ceremony because Devin had a soccer practice. He skipped my college acceptance celebration because Devin was in a school play. He left my 20th birthday dinner early because Devin needed help with homework. Every single time, the excuse was that Devin was younger and needed more attention, that I was old enough to understand and be flexible. I'd been understanding and flexible for years. I'd convinced myself it was normal for parents to prioritize the younger child who needed more hands-on support. But missing my college graduation wasn't about being flexible. It was about where I ranked in my father's list of priorities, and apparently, I was somewhere below Little League playoffs. Graduation day arrived gray and cold. I walked across the stage in front of 3,000 people and heard polite applause from strangers while my parents sat in a dusty baseball field 2 hours away. Priya's parents cheered loud enough for both families, and her mom cried when they handed me my diploma. Afterward, they took me and Priya out to dinner at an expensive steakhouse and toasted to my future. Priya's dad gave a speech about how proud they were of me, how I'd worked full-time while carrying a full-course load, how I'd earned scholarships and graduated with honors despite having no family financial support. He said I was the kind of young man any father would be proud to call his son. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried in a stall for 10 minutes. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad around 8 that night, 6 hours after my ceremony had ended. The message said Devin's team had won their game and were advancing to the championship. He added that he hoped my graduation had gone well and they'd celebrate together soon. No apology, no acknowledgement that he'd missed one of the biggest days of my life. Just an update about Devin's baseball game and a vague promise to celebrate later. I didn't respond. Mom texted the next morning asking for photos from graduation. I sent her a single picture of me in my cap and gown standing between Priya and her parents. She replied saying I looked handsome and she was sorry they couldn't be there, but Devin's game had been so exciting and he'd gotten 2 hits. I read that message 5 times, each time feeling something hard and cold settle deeper in my chest. She was sorry they couldn't be there, as if it had been an unavoidable conflict rather than a deliberate choice, as if Devin's 2 hits at a Little League game somehow justified missing their oldest son's college graduation. The following weekend came, and Dad texted asking when we could do that celebration dinner. I didn't respond for 3 days. When I finally answered, I said I was busy with job interviews and apartment hunting, that I'd let him know when my schedule cleared up. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji. No pressure, no follow-up, no indication that he understood how deeply he'd hurt me. 2 weeks passed, and Mom called asking why I was being distant. I asked her if she was serious, if she genuinely didn't understand why I might be upset that both my parents had chosen to skip my college graduation for a baseball game. She got defensive, saying they hadn't skipped it, they'd had a conflict, that these things happen, and I was being overdramatic. I asked her to explain how they'd had a conflict when they'd known about my graduation for months before Devin's playoff schedule was announced. She said they'd committed to supporting Devin's season and couldn't just abandon him when he needed them. I pointed out that they'd committed to attending my graduation first, and she said that was different because I was an adult who could handle disappointment while Devin was just a child. I told her I'd been handling disappointment my entire life, that I'd spent years watching them prioritize Devin over me, and I was done pretending it didn't matter. She said I was being unfair and selfish, that they loved both their sons equally, that I was taking this too personally. I hung up on her for the second time in a month. Priya suggested I write them a letter explaining exactly how their absence had affected me, putting into words everything I'd been feeling so they couldn't dismiss or minimize it. I spent a week drafting it, editing it, making sure every word was precise and clear. I explained that missing my graduation wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of a pattern that had defined my relationship with them since Devin was born. I detailed every significant event they'd missed, or cut short, because of something related to Devin. I explained how it felt to always be the afterthought, the son who was expected to understand and accommodate while my younger brother got unwavering support and attention. I said I wasn't asking them to love Devin less, but I was done accepting being loved less myself. I told them I needed space to process this hurt and wouldn't be attending family gatherings until they acknowledged the impact of their choices and made meaningful changes. I sent the letter via email and certified mail so they couldn't claim they never received it. Dad called 30 minutes after I hit send. His voice was tight with anger when he said I was being ridiculous and immature, that I was trying to manipulate them with guilt because I didn't get my way. He said every parent has to make difficult choices about how to allocate their time, and they'd made the choice they thought was best for the family as a whole. I asked how missing my college graduation was best for the family, and he said they were teaching me resilience and independence while teaching Devin the value of commitment. I said they were teaching me that I didn't matter as much as my brother and teaching Devin that his needs would always supersede everyone else's. Dad's voice got louder as he said I was twisting everything, that they'd sacrificed constantly for me when I was young, that I'd had their full attention for 13 years before Devin was born, that it wasn't their fault I chose to hold grudges instead of moving forward. I said I'd had their attention for 13 years and then spent the next 9 years watching it disappear. He told me I was acting like a spoiled child and he was disappointed in the man I'd become. I told him I was acting like someone who'd finally realized his father cared more about looking like a good dad to a 9-year-old than actually being a good father to his adult son. I hung up before he could respond. Mom's email arrived the next day, longer and more measured than Dad's angry phone call. She said they were hurt by my letter and didn't recognize the version of their parenting I described. She acknowledged they may have made mistakes, but said all parents do, that perfection isn't achievable, that I was expecting too much. She explained that parenting a young child required more active involvement than parenting an adult, that my independence meant they didn't need to be as present in my daily life, that this was natural and healthy. She said they'd always been proud of me, but their pride didn't require constant demonstration because I was secure enough not to need it. She asked me to reconsider my decision to distance myself, said family was too important to lose over a misunderstanding, that they loved me and wanted me in their lives. I read her email sitting at my new desk in my first post-college apartment, surrounded by boxes I'd moved without their help. Every word in her message felt carefully chosen to avoid actual accountability while making me seem unreasonable for being hurt. She'd acknowledged mistakes in the abstract, but couldn't name a single specific thing they'd done wrong. She'd reframed their neglect as promoting my independence, as if ignoring me was some kind of advanced parenting technique. She'd called missing my graduation a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice. I started typing a response 3 different times and deleted all of them. Nothing I could say would make them understand, because understanding would require them to admit they'd failed me, and they'd made it clear they weren't willing to do that. I closed my laptop and started unpacking boxes, building my life in an apartment my parents had never seen, in a city they hadn't asked about, with a job they'd shown minimal interest in when I told them about the offer. 3 months passed with minimal contact. I sent obligatory responses to their texts, but declined invitations to family dinners and Devin's baseball games. Dad sent a group text in August, announcing that Devin's team had won the championship, including a photo of Devin holding a trophy with both parents beaming beside him. I didn't respond, but I noticed he'd sent it to me, my uncle, my grandparents, and several of his friends. The bye message felt performative, a way of justifying their choice by showing how important Devin's baseball season had been. Look at this trophy. Look at this happy child. Clearly, we made the right decision. I wondered if Dad had sent a similar group text on my graduation day announcing my accomplishment to his contacts. I already knew he hadn't. Priya's family invited me to their Labor Day barbecue, and I spent the afternoon surrounded by people who asked about my new job, who wanted to hear my stories, who treated me like my achievements mattered. Priya's younger sister was 16 and obsessed with college planning. She asked me dozens of questions about my experience, about how I'd chosen my major, about scholarships and internships. Priya's parents listened to every answer like I was sharing profound wisdom rather than basic advice. On the drive home, Priya said her parents thought of me as part of their family. She said her dad had told her I was the son he wished he'd had, that he admired my work ethic and independence. I told her that was nice to hear, but it made me sad that her father saw qualities in me that my own father couldn't seem to acknowledge. She reached over and squeezed my hand. She said my parents' blindness didn't diminish my worth, that their inability to see me clearly was their loss, not my failure. I knew she was right intellectually, but emotionally I still felt like the kid at graduation watching strangers walk across the stage while their families cheered, knowing my own parents were somewhere else, choosing someone else. September brought a surprise that changed everything. Priya and I had been together for 3 years, partners in every sense. We'd talked about marriage and kids and building a life together. We were careful, using protection consistently, planning for a future that felt distant but real. Then, her period was late. Then a pregnancy test came back positive. Then another test confirmed it. Then a doctor's appointment made it official. We sat in my apartment, both of us quiet, processing the reality that we were going to be parents. Priya looked terrified and overwhelmed, her eyes full of tears. She said we weren't ready. We'd just graduated. We were supposed to have time to establish careers and save money and get married first. I held her hand and said we'd figure it out together, that maybe we weren't ready, but we'd rise to meet it. She asked if I was scared, and I said I was absolutely terrified, but also strangely excited, that this wasn't how we'd planned things, but maybe it was how things were supposed to happen. We talked for hours about logistics and fears and hopes. We agreed to get married quickly and quietly, just us and a few friends at the courthouse. We'd tell our families after, once decisions were made and we had a plan in place. Priya's parents took the news better than expected. Her mom cried, but they were happy tears, joy mixed with surprise. Her dad hugged me and said he trusted us to build a good life for this child, that they'd support us however we needed. They offered to help with childcare and expenses, treated the situation as something to celebrate rather than a crisis. My parents were different. I called them 3 weeks after Priya and I had gotten married at the courthouse with her parents as witnesses. Mom answered, and I told her I had news, that Priya was pregnant, that we'd gotten married, that she was going to be a grandmother. There was a long silence before she started asking questions in a tight voice. When was I going to tell them? Why had we gotten married without family present? How could I make these life decisions without consulting them? I said we were adults making adult choices, that we didn't need permission or approval, that I was calling to share news, not ask for validation. Mom's voice got higher as she said, this was exactly the kind of thing that required family involvement, that they should have been included, that getting married at a courthouse without telling anyone was hurtful and inappropriate. I pointed out that they'd skipped my college graduation, the second most important day of my life at that point, so I hadn't thought they'd be particularly invested in my wedding. She said that was a low blow and completely different. I asked how it was different, and she didn't answer. Dad got on the phone, and his first question was whether I was sure the baby was mine. The question hit me like a physical blow. I asked him what the hell he meant by that, and he said he was just being practical, that unexpected pregnancies sometimes involved complicated circumstances, that I should be certain before legally attaching myself to a situation. I told him Priya and I had been together for 3 years, that we were partners and equals, that his question was insulting to both of us. He said he was trying to protect me from making a mistake out of obligation. I said the only mistake I'd made was calling them at all, that I'd wanted to include them in this news because they were my parents, and I kept hoping they'd act like it. Dad's voice got sharp as he said he'd spent 22 years acting like my parent, providing for me, supporting me, giving me opportunities, that my selective memory and victim mentality were getting old. I said he'd spent the last 9 years acting like he had 1 son instead of 2, that he'd been a great father until Devin was born, and then I became the beta test he'd perfected for the real child he actually cared about. He said I was being dramatic and self-centered, that plenty of people had younger siblings without developing entire persecution complexes. I told him plenty of people had parents who managed to love multiple children without ranking them, who showed up to important events for all their kids, who didn't treat their older children like expired priorities. Mom took the phone back and said this conversation was getting too heated, that we all needed to calm down and discuss this rationally later. She asked when Priya was due, and I told her February. She calculated quickly and said we must have gotten pregnant right after graduation. Her tone suggested this was somehow significant, and I realized she thought the pregnancy was my reaction to them missing graduation, as if I'd deliberately gotten my girlfriend pregnant out of spite. I said the pregnancy wasn't planned or timed, that life happens on its own schedule, that we were handling it responsibly and building a family together. Mom said she wanted to meet with us to discuss plans and offer support. I said we didn't need their support. We had Priya's parents and our own resources. Dad took the phone again and said I was being childish, that grandchildren were family matters, that they had a right to be involved. I told him rights weren't the issue, relationships were, that they'd spent months showing me how little I mattered to them, and I was simply accepting that reality. He asked what I wanted from them, his voice frustrated and tired. I said I wanted acknowledgement, real acknowledgement, not defensive justifications or reframed narratives. I wanted them to admit they'd prioritized Devin consistently and repeatedly, that missing my graduation was the culmination of a pattern, not an isolated incident. I wanted them to take responsibility for their choices and their impact instead of blaming me for being hurt by them. Dad said he wasn't going to apologize for being a good father to both his sons, that he'd made the best decisions he could with the information available, that parenting wasn't about perfection, but about trying. I said I wasn't asking for perfection. I was asking for presence, for effort, for indication that I was as important to him as my brother. He said he shouldn't have to prove his love, that his actions over 22 years should speak for themselves. I said his actions over the last 9 years spoke pretty clearly. We agreed to end the conversation before saying things we couldn't take back, though I suspected we'd already crossed that line. I hung up feeling exhausted and sad, the excitement about the baby dampened by the reminder that my child's paternal grandparents were people I couldn't trust to show up when it mattered. Priya asked how it went, and I told her about the whole conversation, including Dad's question about paternity. Her face went through several expressions before settling on cold anger. She said we didn't need those people in our lives, that our child deserved grandparents who were present and supportive, not conditional and judgmental. I agreed but felt guilty about it, like I was depriving my child of family because of my own hurt feelings. She reminded me that family wasn't just biology, that her parents had already embraced us and our baby, that quality mattered more than quantity when it came to grandparents. We decided together that we wouldn't extend an invitation to my parents to meet the baby until they demonstrated genuine accountability and change. It felt harsh but necessary, a boundary that protected our growing family from people who'd proven they couldn't be relied on. The months passed, and my parents made minimal effort to repair the relationship. Mom sent texts occasionally asking about Priya's health and the baby's progress. Dad sent nothing. I responded to Mom's texts with basic information, but didn't elaborate or engage beyond the facts. She never pushed, never asked deeper questions, never suggested getting together to talk. It felt like she was checking boxes on some list of grandmotherly duties without actually investing in the relationship. In November, she texted asking what we needed for the baby, if they could buy furniture or clothes or supplies. I told her we had everything handled, that Priya's parents had been incredibly generous, and we didn't need anything. She sent back a sad emoji and said she wished we'd let them help. I didn't respond. December brought holiday complications. Mom called asking about Christmas plans, saying they'd love to have us and Priya over for dinner, that it could be a chance to reconnect before the baby arrived. I said we were spending Christmas with Priya's family, that it had already been planned, and we weren't changing our plans. She sounded hurt, but accepted it. Then she asked if we could do something the week before Christmas, just a small gathering to exchange gifts and celebrate together. I said I'd think about it and call her back. I never called back. Priya went into labor on February 3rd during a snowstorm that shut down half the city. Her contractions started at 2 a.m, and we drove to the hospital through empty streets, windshield wipers fighting heavy snow. Her parents met us there within an hour, her mom carrying a bag of snacks and supplies, her dad looking nervous and excited. Labor lasted 14 hours, long and exhausting and intense. Priya was incredible, powerful, and focused and brave. I held her hand and coached her breathing and felt completely useless and wholly necessary at the same time. When our daughter finally arrived, tiny and red-faced and screaming, I cried harder than I had at my graduation. We named her Maya, after Priya's grandmother. She was perfect, 6 pounds 8 ounces of fingers and toes and dark hair. Priya's mom cried holding her first grandchild, and Priya's dad took approximately 300 photos in the first hour. The nurses brought paperwork and meals and checked vitals while we sat in our bubble of new family, exhausted and overwhelmed and deeply happy. My phone buzzed with texts from friends congratulating us, from co-workers sending well wishes, from distant relatives I barely spoke to offering support. Nothing from my parents. I realized I hadn't told them Priya was in labor, hadn't thought to call them, hadn't considered including them in this moment. The decision had been unconscious but felt right. They'd shown me repeatedly that they couldn't be trusted to prioritize me, to show up when it mattered, to be present in my life. I wasn't going to give them the opportunity to disappoint me again, especially not on a day as important as my daughter's birth. We'd set a boundary about them meeting Maya, and I was going to hold it. They would not meet their granddaughter until they acknowledged what they'd done and committed to doing better. Not just words, actual change, demonstrated effort over time, consistent presence, real relationship. Anything less, and they'd remain distant relatives Maya knew about, but didn't really know. Names on a family tree without substance or connection. 3 days after Maya's birth, we were home trying to figure out how to keep a tiny human alive on no sleep. Priya was recovering, exhausted but radiant, completely absorbed in our daughter. Her parents came by daily with food and help. Her mom showing us how to swaddle and soothe, her dad handling laundry and dishes without being asked. They were grandparents in every sense that mattered, present and supportive, and unconditionally loving. My phone rang on day 4 with a call from Mom. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She asked how we were doing, and I said we were adjusting to life with a newborn. There was a pause before she asked if we'd had the baby yet. The question stunned me. I said yes. Maya had been born 4 days ago. Mom's voice got tight as she asked why no one had told them, why they'd been excluded from their own grandchild's birth. I explained that we hadn't excluded them. We'd set a boundary about them meeting Maya until they addressed the issues in our relationship. She said that was punishing an innocent baby for adult problems, that Maya deserved to know all her grandparents. I said Maya deserved grandparents who were present and reliable, who wouldn't rank her against other grandchildren when it came time to show up for important moments. Mom got quiet and then said she didn't understand what I wanted from them, that they'd apologized for missing graduation. I asked when they'd apologized, because I'd received no apology, only justifications and defensiveness. She said they'd acknowledged the conflict and explained their reasoning, that I'd refused to accept their explanation. I told her explanation wasn't apology, that justifying their choice wasn't the same as taking responsibility for its impact. She said she was trying to make amends, and I was being stubborn and unforgiving. I asked what amends she was making, specifically. What had changed? What were they doing differently? She didn't have an answer. I told Mom that until they could clearly articulate what they'd done wrong and demonstrate sustained change behavior, they wouldn't be meeting Maya. She started crying, saying I was being cruel, that they'd made one mistake, and I was using it to cut them out of my life. I corrected her, saying they'd made hundreds of mistakes over 9 years, creating a pattern that culminated in missing my graduation. I said I wasn't cutting them out. I was holding a boundary until they showed me they'd learned and grown. She asked how long I expected them to wait, and I said as long as it took for them to genuinely understand the problem. She said that was vague and unfair, that I was moving goalposts and setting impossible standards. I said the standard was simple: acknowledge the pattern, take responsibility without deflection, and demonstrate through actions over time that they could be reliable and present. She said she couldn't control how I interpreted their efforts, that I'd already decided they were inadequate parents, and nothing they did would change my mind. I told her that was exactly the problem. They were focused on defending themselves instead of understanding my experience. She said she'd spent months trying to understand, that I was the one refusing to meet them halfway. I asked what halfway looked like when I'd spent years accepting less than I deserved. She didn't answer. The conversation ended with her saying she'd pray I'd soften my heart and realize family was too important to lose over pride. I said I wasn't losing family, I was protecting my daughter from people who couldn't be counted on. I hung up feeling sad but resolved. Maya deserved better than grandparents who would show up inconsistently, who would prioritize other grandchildren when it was convenient, who would teach her that being understanding meant accepting less than she was worth. Word spread through the family that I'd had a baby and wasn't letting my parents meet her. My uncle called saying I was being unreasonable, that parents make mistakes and kids have to forgive them. I asked if he'd forgive his father for missing his college graduation to watch someone else's baseball game. He said that was different because his father was dead. I said that wasn't the same thing and he knew it. He said family was complicated and I was being black and white about something that existed in gray areas. I told him that showing up for your kids' major life events wasn't a gray area, it was baseline decency. He said I was being harsh and judgmental, that I'd feel differently when Maya was older and making me feel inadequate as a parent. I said I hoped I would feel differently, that I hoped Maya would hold me accountable when I failed her, that I wanted to be the kind of father who could hear criticism and grow from it rather than defending my ego. He said I was young and idealistic, and reality would humble me eventually. I said if reality meant accepting neglect as normal, I'd prefer to stay idealistic. My grandmother called next, saying I was breaking my mother's heart, that she'd talked to Mom, and she was devastated about not meeting her grandchild. I asked Grandma if she'd talked to me about my devastation at graduating college without my parents present. She said that was in the past, and I needed to focus on the future. I told her. The past informed the future, that people who couldn't acknowledge their mistakes would inevitably repeat them. She said I was holding a grudge and grudges poisoned families. I said boundaries weren't grudges, they were self-protection. She said when I was a parent, I'd understand how hard it was to balance multiple children's needs. I said I was a parent now, and I understood perfectly, which was why I knew missing one child's graduation for another child's baseball game was indefensible. She said I was being disrespectful and cruel. I said I'd learned from the best. She hung up on me. Devin called in March, his voice awkward and uncertain. He said Mom and Dad had been really sad lately, that he'd heard them talking about me and the baby they hadn't met. He asked what was going on, why I wasn't talking to them anymore. I tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that sometimes adults have disagreements that take time to work through, that it wasn't his fault, that I loved him even though things were complicated with our parents. He asked if it was because they went to his baseball game instead of my graduation. The question caught me off guard. I asked what he knew about that, and he said he'd heard Dad talking to Uncle Phil about it, saying I was still mad about them missing my graduation. Devin's voice got small as he said he was sorry they'd chosen his game, that he didn't know it would cause all this, that he wished they'd gone to my graduation instead. I felt my chest tighten. I told him none of this was his fault, that he was a kid and kids shouldn't have to worry about these things, that the problem was between me and our parents. He asked if I was mad at him, and I said absolutely not, that I could never be mad at him for being a kid. He asked when he could meet Maya, his voice hopeful and nervous. I said we'd figure something out, that maybe he could come visit with Priya's parents as chaperones. He said that would be weird, but cool. We talked for a few more minutes about school and baseball and normal kid things. When we hung up, I felt terrible that he'd been carrying guilt about something that wasn't his responsibility. I texted Mom saying Devin shouldn't be in the middle of this, that using him as an intermediary was inappropriate and unfair. She texted back saying she hadn't told him to call, that he'd made that choice himself, that maybe I should consider how my actions were affecting my brother. I replied that my actions were protecting my daughter, that their actions over 9 years had affected me, that cause and effect were worth examining. She didn't respond. April brought Maya's 2-month checkup and the realization that she was growing impossibly fast. Priya and I were settling into parenthood, exhausted but functional, learning our daughter's patterns and needs. Priya's parents were integral to our survival, watching Maya while we worked, teaching us tricks and techniques, loving their granddaughter with fierce devotion. I watched Priya's dad hold Maya while singing old Hindi lullabies and felt grateful and sad simultaneously. Grateful that my daughter had grandparents who were present and engaged, sad that my own parents were missing this because they couldn't admit fault. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad, the first direct communication since the angry call months ago. The message said he'd been thinking about things, that maybe he hadn't handled situations as well as he could have, that he wanted to talk. I stared at the text for a long time before responding. I asked if he was willing to acknowledge the pattern of prioritizing Devin over me, specifically and without justification. He replied that he'd made decisions he thought were right at the time, that hindsight was revealing complexity he hadn't seen. I said that was closer to accountability than I'd heard before, but still fell short of actual admission. He asked what I wanted him to say, and I told him I needed him to say clearly and plainly that he'd failed me repeatedly, that missing my graduation was wrong, that he understood why I was hurt and didn't blame me for that hurt. He didn't respond for 2 hours. Then a text came through. I failed you repeatedly. Missing your graduation was wrong. I understand why you're hurt, and I don't blame you for that hurt. The words looked copied from my previous message, but I didn't care. Seeing them in text from him felt significant. I replied asking if he meant those words, or was just saying what I wanted to hear. He responded that he'd spent months defending himself because admitting failure felt like weakness, that he'd been a coward about facing what he'd done. He said he was tired of being a coward and wanted to be a better father and grandfather. I called Dad instead of texting back. He answered on the first ring. His voice was subdued, lacking the defensive edge I'd become accustomed to. I asked him what had changed, what had prompted this shift. He said he'd been watching old videos of me as a kid, going through boxes in the garage and finding footage from when I was Devin's age. He said he'd seen himself in those videos, being present and engaged, the kind of father he'd prided himself on being. Then he'd realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd been that present with me, that somewhere along the way I'd become an obligation to manage rather than a son to know. He said watching Devin grow up had made him nostalgic for my childhood, but instead of using that nostalgia to reconnect with me, he'd just invested more in Devin. I asked why he'd done that, why he'd let our relationship atrophy. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he'd convinced himself that my independence meant I didn't need him anymore, that focusing on Devin was efficient parenting because I was already launched. He said he'd been lazy and selfish, taking the path of least resistance rather than maintaining effort across both relationships. He said missing my graduation had felt justified in the moment, a reasonable choice between two important events. But seeing my reaction and the consequences that followed had forced him to examine his pattern of choices. He said he'd failed me, not once, but hundreds of times, in small ways that accumulated into a relationship defined by my absence from his priorities. He said he was sorry. Actually sorry, without qualifications or justifications. The apology landed differently than I'd expected, not washing away the hurt, but acknowledging its validity. I asked Dad what he wanted going forward, what he hoped would happen. He said he wanted a relationship with me and with Maya, that he wanted to be a grandfather who showed up, but he understood if I needed time and space. He said he wasn't asking me to forgive him immediately, just to consider leaving the door open for possibility. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but words were cheap, that I'd need to see consistent change behavior over time before I'd trust him around my daughter. He asked what that would look like, and I said I needed him to prioritize me sometimes, to initiate contact regularly, to show interest in my life without prompting. I said I needed him to acknowledge his pattern in front of Mom and the extended family, to own his failures publicly the way I'd been hurt publicly. He said that felt exposing and difficult, but he understood why it mattered. I asked if he was willing to do it, and he said yes. I told him I'd think about what reconnection might look like, that I'd talk to Priya, that he shouldn't expect quick forgiveness or immediate access to Maya. He said he understood and he'd wait as long as it took. We hung up, and I sat with the conversation, turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe his words, to accept this olive branch and move forward. Part of me was wary, wondering if this was genuine growth or strategic manipulation to gain access to his granddaughter. Priya listened to the whole story and said we should proceed cautiously, that Dad's words were good but actions would tell the truth. She suggested supervised visits with both of us present, clear boundaries about behavior and expectations, and immediate consequences if he reverted to old patterns. I agreed and texted Dad with those terms. He accepted without argument. We scheduled a meeting for the following weekend at our apartment. 1 hour with Maya, both Priya and I present the entire time. The morning of Dad's visit, I was more nervous than I'd expected. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, organized Maya's nursery, prepared conversation topics to avoid awkward silences. Priya reminded me this wasn't a performance, that Dad needed to accept our family as we were, chaos and all. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Dad stood in the hallway holding flowers for Priya and a gift bag for Maya. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, more uncertain. I invited him in, and the apartment suddenly felt smaller. He handed Priya the flowers and complimented her, asked how she was feeling postpartum. She was polite, but reserved, accepting the flowers without warmth. I brought Maya out from her nursery, 2 months old and alert, her dark eyes taking in the stranger. Dad's face crumpled when he saw her. He asked if he could hold her, and I nodded, watching carefully as he cradled his granddaughter for the first time. He looked at her with such tenderness that it hurt, because I could see the father he'd been when I was young, the one I'd lost somewhere around Devin's birth. He told Maya she was beautiful, that he was sorry he'd missed her arrival, that he hoped to know her better. Maya grabbed his finger, and he started crying quietly. We sat in the living room making stilted conversation, Dad asking about Maya's sleep schedule and feeding routine, sharing memories of when I was a baby. He told stories I'd never heard, details about my first steps and first words, moments he'd apparently treasured enough to remember decades later. It was strange hearing evidence of his love in the past tense, proof that he'd once been invested in me, the way he was now invested in Devin. I asked him directly what had changed between then and now, what had caused him to shift focus so completely. He thought about it before answering that nothing dramatic had changed. It had been death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual choice to prioritize Devin had felt reasonable in isolation, but they'd accumulated into a pattern he hadn't noticed until it was entrenched. Dad said he'd been thinking about legacy lately, about what kind of father and grandfather he wanted to be remembered as. He said he'd realized that being remembered well required being present consistently, that you couldn't coast on past investment and expect relationships to maintain themselves. He said he'd taken me for granted, assumed our bond was strong enough to withstand neglect, and he'd been wrong. He asked about my job and actually listened to the answer, asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. He asked about our apartment and our plans for the future, about Priya's family, and how we were managing childcare. The conversation felt effortful but real, like he was relearning how to be my father after years of autopilot. When the hour was up, he handed Maya back reluctantly and thanked us for giving him this chance. He asked if he could come back next week, and I said we'd see how things went. He nodded and left without pushing, respecting the boundary. After he left, Priya asked what I thought. I said it felt genuine but fragile, that I wasn't ready to trust fully, but I was willing to keep the door cracked open. We agreed to continue supervised visits, to maintain boundaries, to protect Maya first and foremost. Over the next month, Dad came every Saturday at 2 o'clock. He was punctual, prepared, engaged. He asked about my week and remembered details from previous conversations. He brought age-appropriate gifts for Maya without overdoing it. He interacted with Priya respectfully, acknowledged his past dismissiveness of our relationship, thanked her for allowing him into their home. Slowly, incrementally, something started to shift. The visits felt less like auditions and more like actual family time. Dad started texting during the week, checking in, sharing articles he thought I'd find interesting. He asked to video chat with Maya and made funny faces that made her smile. He was trying, consistently and visibly trying. Mom was a different story. She'd called after Dad's first visit asking why he was allowed to meet Maya, but she wasn't. I explained that Dad had done the work of acknowledging his failures and committing to change, that he'd held himself accountable in ways she hadn't. She said she'd apologized repeatedly and I'd rejected every attempt. I asked her to detail what she'd apologized for specifically, and she couldn't articulate it beyond a vague, hurting you. I told her that until she could clearly name what she'd done wrong, demonstrate understanding of the pattern and its impact, and commit to specific changed behaviors, she wouldn't be meeting Maya. She said I was holding her to impossible standards that I wasn't holding Dad to. I said Dad had met the exact same standards, that she was welcome to do the work he'd done. She said she didn't know what work that was, that Dad wouldn't tell her about their conversations. I said that was between them, that she needed to figure out her own accountability rather than copying his. She hung up frustrated, and I felt guilty but firm. Maya deserved grandparents who were all in, not people going through the motions to gain access. In June, Dad asked if he could take me to lunch. Just the two of us, no Maya as buffer. I agreed nervously, and we met at a restaurant downtown. He said he wanted to talk about something difficult, that he needed my advice. I braced for some request about Mom or Devin, but instead he said he'd been thinking about his relationship with Devin and recognizing patterns. He said he could see himself overcorrecting with Devin, being too involved and not allowing him to develop independence. He asked how to be present without being overbearing, how to support without controlling. The question floored me. Dad was asking for parenting advice, acknowledging that he'd made mistakes and wanted to do better going forward. We talked for 2 hours about parenting philosophies, about balance and boundaries, about showing up without taking over. I shared things I'd learned in my few months as a father, and he listened like I was the expert. It felt surreal and healing simultaneously. Dad started making changes with Devin that summer. He stopped attending every single baseball game and practice, backed off from constant involvement, encouraged Devin to solve his own problems. Devin came to visit us in July, brought by Priya's parents per our arrangement. He met Maya for the first time and was surprisingly gentle with her, asking permission before touching her, making age-appropriate conversation. He told me Dad had been different lately, that he was giving him more space and expecting him to be more independent. Devin said he kind of liked it, but also felt weird, like Dad was less interested in him than before. I explained that Dad was learning how to be a better parent, that sometimes that meant stepping back instead of hovering. Devin asked if I thought Dad loved him less now, and I said absolutely not, that Dad was learning how to love in healthier ways. We threw a football in the park and talked about school and friends and normal stuff. Devin asked if I was still mad at Dad, and I said I was working on not being mad, that forgiveness was a process. He said he was glad because he wanted us all to be a family again. I told him we'd always be family, but family looked different now, and that was okay. He seemed to accept that. When Priya's parents dropped him off at home, he hugged me tight and said he missed me. I told him I missed him too, and we'd hang out more often. After he left, Priya said watching me with Devin made her emotional, that I was breaking generational patterns by refusing to let resentment poison my relationship with my brother. I said Devin was innocent in all this, that he deserved a brother who showed up for him the way my parents should have shown up for me. August brought Maya's 6-month milestone and a family gathering I'd been avoiding. My grandmother's 80th birthday party was scheduled for Labor Day weekend, and the entire extended family would be there. Dad called asking if I'd consider attending, saying it would mean a lot to Grandma and give us a chance to interact as a family in a neutral setting. I was hesitant, but Priya thought it might be good, a test of whether Dad's changes were sustainable in group settings. We agreed to go for a few hours, bringing Maya, but keeping our expectations low. The party was at a rented hall, decorated with photos spanning Grandma's 8 decades, extended family-filled tables, cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts and uncles who'd heard various versions of our family drama. We arrived late deliberately, hoping to avoid prolonged interactions. Dad met us at the door and his face lit up seeing Maya. He'd been consistent with visits for 4 months now, never missing a Saturday, always engaged and present. He offered to introduce us around, but I said we could manage. Mom was across the room talking to my aunt. She saw us, and her expression cycled through surprise, hurt, and something harder to identify. She started walking over, but Dad intercepted her, and they had a brief, intense conversation I couldn't hear. Mom went back to her original spot, and Dad returned to us. He said he'd asked her to give us space, that ambushing us wasn't the way to reconnect. I appreciated the intervention. We made rounds greeting family members, showing off. Maya to relatives who cooed and commented on her features. Several people made pointed remarks about finally getting to meet her, about family being important, about forgiveness. I smiled and deflected, refusing to engage in public dissection of private pain. Devin found us near the cake table and was thrilled to see Maya again. He'd grown since July, shooting up several inches, looking more like a preteen than a child. He held Maya carefully and showed her off to his friends, like she was a trophy he'd won. I watched him with his sister and felt grateful that whatever dysfunction existed in our family hadn't poisoned their relationship before it started. Grandma called everyone together for a speech about family and legacy and staying connected across generations. She was 80 years old and still sharp, still commanding attention effortlessly. She talked about raising children during harder times, about sacrifice and commitment, about family being the only thing that mattered in the end. She made pointed eye contact with me during the part about forgiveness, and I looked away. After her speech, she approached us directly. She hugged Priya and admired Maya, then turned to me with that grandmother look that demanded honesty. She said she was glad I'd come, that family was too important to lose over disagreements. I said some disagreements were worth having, that some boundaries were worth maintaining. She said I'd softened recently and asked what changed. I told her Dad had done the work of accountability, and I'd responded to that effort. She asked about Mom, and I said Mom hadn't done the work yet. Grandma nodded slowly and said she'd observed the situation more carefully than people realized, that she'd noticed patterns over the years that troubled her. She said she'd talked to Mom about priorities and presence, about the difference between explaining and excusing. She said change was hard for everyone, especially admitting fault to your children. I asked if she was defending Mom, and she said no, she was explaining her. She said Mom had her own childhood wounds that made accountability difficult, that sometimes people couldn't give what they'd never received. I said that was sad, but not my responsibility to fix, that I couldn't heal my mother's childhood trauma at the expense of protecting my daughter. Grandma said that was fair and wise, that boundaries were love and action. She kissed Maya's forehead and told me I was a good father, better than I'd been taught. The compliment hit unexpectedly hard. I thanked her and she moved on to other relatives, her party continuing around us. Mom approached later when I was alone getting punch. She said we needed to talk, and I said not here, not at Grandma's party. She persisted, saying she'd given me space for months and couldn't wait any longer. I told her space wasn't something she'd given me. It was something I'd taken because she couldn't respect boundaries. She flinched at that, but pressed on. She said she'd been reflecting on the past, that she could see patterns she'd been defensive about before. She said missing my graduation had been a mistake, that she should have prioritized differently. I asked what specifically she would have done differently, and she said she would have come to my graduation and sent Dad to Devon's game. I pointed out that was still prioritizing Devon, just outsourcing Dad to handle him while she handled me. She looked confused and asked what I meant. I explained that the problem wasn't just about which parent attended which event. It was about them as a unit choosing Devon over me consistently. She said they'd been trying to split responsibilities, that it wasn't realistic for both parents to attend everything. I agreed, but said graduation wasn't everything, it was the thing, the once-in-a-lifetime event that shouldn't have been weighed against a random baseball game. She said Devon's game hadn't been random to him, it had been important. I said my graduation had been important to me, and the fact that she was still comparing them showed she didn't understand the fundamental problem. She got quiet, and then asked what she needed to do to meet her granddaughter. I told her the same thing I told her in June. Clearly articulate what she'd done wrong, demonstrate understanding of the pattern and its impact, and commit to specific change behaviors. She said she was trying, but I kept moving the goalposts. I said the goalpost had never moved, she just kept refusing to acknowledge where it actually was. We were interrupted by Devon asking for cake, and Mom walked away frustrated. I felt exhausted by the same circular conversation we'd been having for months. The party wound down, and we said goodbye to Grandma, congratulating her on 80 years well lived. Dad walked us to our car and thanked us for coming, said it meant a lot to him that we'd made the effort. I told him it was still hard being around Mom, that her continued defensiveness made family events stressful. He said he'd noticed, that he'd been encouraging her to actually examine her behavior, rather than just going through motions. He said change was happening, but slowly, that Mom's relationship with accountability was more complicated than his had been. I asked what he meant, and he said Mom had been raised in a family where admitting fault was weakness, where parents were always right and children owed unconditional respect regardless of how they were treated. He said she'd internalized those messages deeply, and unlearning them was painful work. I said I sympathized but couldn't prioritize her emotional comfort over Maya's well-being. He agreed and said he wasn't asking me to, just explaining the context. He said he'd keep working on her, encouraging growth, but ultimately, she had to choose change for herself. We drove home with Maya sleeping in her car seat, and I felt the weight of family complexity pressing down. Priya asked if I was okay, and I said I was. Processing that seeing Mom made me realize how different their approaches were. Dad had been humble and accountable while Mom remained defensive and comparative. Dad had done the work while Mom was still arguing about whether the work was necessary. The contrast was stark and clarifying. Over the next months, Dad continued his consistent presence. He came to Maya's first Halloween, helping her try on her pumpkin costume, taking dozens of photos. He came to Thanksgiving at our apartment, bringing sides Mom had made but not pushing for her inclusion. He came to Maya's first Christmas, watching her be confused by wrapping paper, laughing at her startled expression with each new toy. He was becoming the grandfather I'd hoped for, present and engaged and reliable, and slowly, incrementally, he was becoming more of a father to me too. In January, a year after Maya's birth, Dad invited me to breakfast. He said he'd done something and wanted to tell me before I heard from someone else. I braced for bad news, but he said he'd written a letter to our extended family, acknowledging his failures as a father and explaining why our relationship had been strained. He said he'd taken full responsibility for missing my graduation and the years of prioritizing Devon, that he'd been specific about his mistakes and their consequences. He said several family members had responded supportively while others had been critical, saying he was humiliating himself unnecessarily. He said he didn't care about their opinions, that I'd asked him to own his failures publicly, and he'd finally done it. He handed me a copy of the letter, and I read through it with tears burning behind my eyes. The letter was detailed and honest, naming specific incidents, acknowledging patterns, taking responsibility without deflection or excuse. It explained why I'd set boundaries around Maya, validating my choices and defending my right to protect my family. It asked family members to respect our situation and support our healing rather than pressuring reconciliation on anyone else's timeline. The letter was everything I'd needed to hear, written out in black and white and sent to everyone who judged me for holding boundaries. I looked at Dad across the table and saw him nervous, waiting for my reaction. I told him this was huge, that public accountability was something most people never achieved. He said it should have happened a year ago, but better late than never. I agreed and felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of old resentment, not disappearing but transforming into something more manageable. Dad asked if this changed anything for us, and I said it changed everything. The demonstrated follow-through on hard commitments meant more than any words could express. He smiled and said he'd keep demonstrating then, that this was just the beginning of sustained effort. Mom called that afternoon crying. She'd received Dad's letter and was humiliated, saying he'd made their private family issues public fodder, that people were judging her and she couldn't face anyone. I said Dad had done what needed to be done, that accountability sometimes felt humiliating but was necessary for healing. She said I'd put him up to it, that I'd demanded this public shaming as punishment. I told her no one made Dad write that letter, that he'd chosen accountability over comfort because he valued our relationship more than his pride. She said she couldn't believe he'd thrown her under the bus like that he'd made her look like a terrible mother. I said he'd owned his own failures, that if she felt implicated, it was because she shared responsibility for those failures. She said this was all my fault, that I'd manipulated her husband and turned her son against her. I said I'd set boundaries, and Dad had chosen to respect them, that respecting boundaries wasn't manipulation. She said she'd lost her family because I couldn't let go of one missed event. I corrected her, saying she was losing access to her family because she'd spent a year refusing to acknowledge a pattern of behavior that hurt me deeply. She said she was done trying, that if I wanted a relationship with her, I'd have to apologize for excluding her from her granddaughter's life. I told her I wasn't excluding her. I was maintaining a boundary she could cross any time by doing the required work. She said she was the mother, and I was the child, that she didn't owe me apologies or explanations. I said that attitude was exactly why we were in this situation, that parenting didn't end at 18, and parents absolutely owed their adult children apologies when they caused harm. She hung up on me, and I let her go. Part of me felt guilty for the hardness between us, but a larger part felt clear that I'd made the right choice. Maya would grow up knowing her paternal grandfather as someone present and reliable. If she knew her paternal grandmother at all, it would be because that grandmother had chosen growth over ego. Maya's first birthday arrived in February, with a small party at our apartment. Priya's parents helped us prepare, decorating with pink balloons and setting up a smash cake for Maya to destroy. We'd invited close friends and a few family members, including Dad and Devin. Mom wasn't invited because the boundary remained firm. Dad arrived early with Devin, both carrying wrapped presents. Devin had grown again, now looking properly preteen, all gangly limbs and changing voice. He was gentle with Maya, playing peekaboo and making her laugh. Dad helped set up, hanging streamers and arranging food, acting like a grandfather who belonged rather than a guest on probation. When we sang happy birthday and Maya demolished her cake, getting frosting everywhere, Dad took photos and laughed and looked genuinely joyful. After the party wound down and guests left, Dad asked if he could talk to me privately. We stepped into my bedroom and he said he'd been thinking about milestones and presents, about the importance of showing up. He said he understood now that missing my graduation hadn't just been about one day. It had been about signaling that his presence in my life was conditional and optional. He said he was grateful I'd given him the chance to rebuild, that knowing Maya and being in my life was a gift he didn't take for granted. He asked if I'd considered loosening boundaries around visits, maybe letting him take Maya for a few hours without supervision. I told him I'd been thinking about it, that his consistency over the past year had rebuilt trust significantly. I said Priya and I would discuss it and let him know. He thanked me and said whatever timeline we needed was fine, that he'd proven himself for a year and he could prove himself for however much longer it took. We rejoined the party and he left shortly after with Devin, both of them hugging us goodbye, Devin telling Maya happy birthday, even though she couldn't understand. Priya and I talked that night after Maya was asleep about Dad's request for unsupervised time. She said she felt comfortable with it given his consistent behavior, but wanted to start small, maybe an hour at a nearby park where we could be available if needed. I agreed, and we established clear guidelines, specific activities, limited time frame, immediate communication if anything felt off. I texted Dad the parameters and he accepted gratefully. The first unsupervised visit happened on a Saturday morning in March. Dad picked up Maya, buckled her carefully into the car seat we'd installed in his car, and drove to a park 10 minutes away. Priya and I stayed home, trying not to hover, texting only once to check in. Dad sent back a photo of Maya on a baby swing, smiling wide. He brought her back exactly on time, gave us a full report of activities, and thanked us for trusting him. The visits expanded gradually. An hour became two became half a day. Dad proved repeatedly that he could be trusted, that he'd show up when promised, that Maya's well-being was his priority. By summer, he was keeping her every Saturday morning, taking her to parks and libraries, building the grandfather-granddaughter relationship we'd hoped for. Devin joined sometimes, playing with his niece, developing his own relationship with her. Watching them together made me grateful that Maya would know her uncle without the complications that defined my childhood. In August, Dad asked if he could take Maya overnight. Priya and I discussed extensively before agreeing, setting up his house with supplies and safety measures, reviewing emergency protocols. The first overnight went smoothly. Dad sent updates throughout, shared photos, brought Maya back Sunday morning well-rested and happy. It became a regular thing, one overnight a month, giving Priya and me a chance to reconnect as a couple while Maya built memories with her grandfather. The relationship that had been broken was being rebuilt, not perfectly, but genuinely. Mom reached out in September, a year and a half after Maya's birth. Her email was different from previous communications, less defensive and more vulnerable. She said she'd been working with a therapist on family patterns and personal accountability. She said she'd finally understood why her approach hadn't worked, that explaining her reasoning had been a way to avoid acknowledging my pain. She said she could see the pattern of prioritizing Devin, that missing my graduation had been wrong regardless of Devin's needs. She said she was sorry, specifically and plainly sorry, for years of making me feel secondary. She said she understood if I needed more time, but she wanted to start rebuilding our relationship if I was willing. The email felt different from her previous attempts, more specific and less focused on defending herself. I called Dad to ask his opinion, and he said Mom had been doing real work, attending therapy consistently, having hard conversations with him about their parenting choices. He said the change seemed genuine, but he couldn't guarantee anything, that ultimately I had to decide what felt right. I talked to Priya about it, and she said we could offer Mom the same path Dad had taken: supervised visits, clear boundaries, gradual building of trust through consistent behavior. I emailed Mom back outlining those terms. She accepted without argument. We scheduled our first meeting for Saturday afternoon, 1 hour at our apartment, both Priya and I present. Mom arrived exactly on time, carrying a small gift for Maya and flowers for Priya. She looked nervous, older, less certain than I'd ever seen her. I invited her in, and she immediately teared up seeing Maya, now 18 months old and toddling around. She asked if she could say hello, and I nodded. Mom knelt down and introduced herself to her granddaughter, who looked at this stranger curiously. Maya warmed up slowly, accepting a toy Mom offered, playing nearby while Mom watched with obvious longing. We sat in the living room, and Mom asked about Maya's development, her schedule, her personality. She listened to the answers without interrupting, asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. She asked about my work and Priya's career, about our lives, showing care without being invasive. After 30 minutes, she said she wanted to address things directly, that she'd spent too long avoiding uncomfortable truths. She said she'd been wrong to miss my graduation, that no child's baseball game justified missing another child's college graduation. She said she'd been wrong to consistently prioritize Devin, that she'd rationalized it as attending to the child who needed more active parenting, while ignoring that I'd needed presence even as an adult. She said she'd been wrong to be defensive when confronted, that protecting her ego had mattered more than understanding my experience. She said she was sorry, fully and completely sorry, and she understood if I couldn't forgive her immediately, but she hoped to earn forgiveness over time. The apology was specific and unqualified, everything I'd asked for months ago. I told her I appreciated her words but needed to see consistent behavior before fully trusting her. She said she understood and was prepared to prove herself the way Dad had. She asked about parameters for future visits, and I outlined the same gradual progression Dad had followed. She accepted without negotiation. The hour ended, and Mom thanked us for giving her a chance, told Maya she loved her, even though they were just meeting. She left, and I felt exhausted but cautiously hopeful. Priya said Mom seemed genuinely different, more humble, less defensive. She said we'd see over time whether the change was sustainable. Over the following months, Mom proved herself through consistency. She came for weekly visits, always punctual, always respectful of boundaries. She interacted with Maya gently, building trust slowly. She asked about my life, and actually listened, remembered details from previous conversations, showed interest without being intrusive. She didn't complain about the boundaries or compare her access to Dad's. She simply did the work. By Maya's second birthday, both my parents were regular presences in our lives. They'd rebuilt relationships through consistent effort and genuine accountability. The pain of my graduation didn't disappear, but it transformed into something more manageable, a scar, rather than an open wound. We had a larger party for Maya's second birthday, inviting both sides of the family and several friends. Mom and Dad were there together, cooperative and engaged, functioning as the grandparents I'd hoped for. They played with Maya, helped with setup and cleanup, interacted with Priya's parents respectfully. Watching them together, I could see the work they'd both done, the growth they'd achieved. They'd never be perfect parents, but they'd become present ones, and that was enough. During the party, Grandma pulled me aside and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything. She said setting boundaries and maintaining them until people rose to meet them was brave, that most people would have caved to family pressure and accepted less than they deserved. She said Maya was lucky to have a father who would protect her and model healthy relationships. I told her I'd learned from watching generations of family dysfunction and decided to break the pattern. She laughed and said that was the best revenge, refusing to repeat mistakes. Devin, now 11 and solidly in middle school, asked if things were back to normal with our family. I told him things were better than normal, that we'd rebuilt on stronger foundations. He said he was glad because he liked having everyone together. I ruffled his hair and said I liked it too. As the party wound down and guests left, I stood holding Maya and looking at my family, rebuilt and redefined. Priya came up beside me and asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking that boundaries had saved our family, that demanding accountability had been worth the pain of estrangement. She kissed my cheek and said I'd given Maya the gift of grandparents who showed up, and that was worth everything. 5 years passed and Maya started kindergarten. She was bright and confident, surrounded by love from both sides of her family. My relationship with my parents continued evolving, not perfect but functional, built on honesty and consistent effort. Dad had become the grandfather he should have been from the start, present and engaged without being overbearing. Mom had worked hard to rebuild trust, proving through years of consistency that she'd genuinely changed. They babysat regularly, attended Maya's activities, celebrated her milestones. They'd become the grandparents I'd needed them to become, even if it took losing access to their granddaughter for them to get there. Devin graduated high school, and I attended his graduation, cheering loudly when he walked across the stage. Dad was there too, emotional and proud. After the ceremony, Devin thanked me for coming and said it meant a lot that I'd made the effort despite our complicated history. I told him I wouldn't have missed it, that showing up for family was important. Dad overheard and gave me a meaningful look, acknowledging the full circle moment. Later that night, Dad and I sat on his back porch while Devin celebrated with friends. He said he thought about my graduation often, about the choice he'd made and its consequences. He said missing that day was his biggest regret, that no relationship with me would have been worth being right about prioritizing a baseball game. I told him the regret had led to growth, that losing access to Maya had forced both him and Mom to become better people and better parents. He said that was generous of me to frame it that way. I said it was honest, that pain could be transformative if people were willing to learn from it. We sat in comfortable silence, the distance between us finally closed through years of intentional effort. When Maya was 7, Priya got pregnant again. We told my parents together, and their excitement was genuine and immediate. Mom cried happy tears, and Dad looked thrilled at the prospect of another grandchild. They asked how they could help, what we needed, when they could visit after the birth. Their response was everything I'd wanted 5 years ago when we'd announced Maya's pregnancy. The difference was stark and meaningful. This time, I didn't hesitate to include them. This time, I trusted them to show up. And they did. They were at the hospital hours after our son was born, meeting him while he was still wrinkled and new. They visited regularly during those early chaotic weeks, bringing meals and helping with Maya, being the support system grandparents should be. Watching them with both my children, I felt grateful that boundaries had worked, that demanding accountability had transformed our family. My son would grow up knowing grandparents who were present and reliable because I'd refused to accept less and they'd risen to meet my expectations. The story of my graduation became family lore, told as a cautionary tale about priorities and presence. We didn't hide the pain or pretend it hadn't happened. We acknowledged it as the catalyst for necessary change, the crisis that forced growth. And when my children were old enough to understand, I'd tell them the full story, teaching them that boundaries weren't cruelty but love and action, that demanding better from people was a gift, even when it felt like punishment.